Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and this is My Life as a Landlord. Today, I am thrilled to have an amazing guest based in Greater Houston, Texas, and he brings a fascinating perspective to real estate, one that we actually share, which is really kind of cool. He's trained as an engineer, which means he looks at properties through a lens of what he calls financial science, which I like. He and his team manage a portfolio of 22 workforce housing assets across Texas, and their philosophy is one I love. They buy properties with the mindset that they should never have to sell them. Yay! Welcome, Derek. Thanks for being here.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jen. Yeah, and I'm super happy to be here, and excited that we get to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, tell us how it all started. Corpus Christi, you're a young buck and you decided you would just jump into real estate with both feet. How'd that happen?
Yeah. So I found my first investment property in 2018. At the time, I have three kids, family. My wife and I were living in Corpus Christi, and I worked in oil and gas at the time, in the downstream part of oil and gas in oil refining. And my background, as you said, is in engineering, and I spent most of my days in a production facility making fuels. And most of that time in my life was dedicated to, producing a really great engineering product for me and my team. And I really had this kind of inner desire. Well, I need to build something not so traditional, and I've always kind of had this part of me that wanted to build something of my own.
Mm.
And of course, as an engineer, you're building something that's not yours. I mean, it's a great profession, and it's one that I learned so much from, and I still love. Um, but I wanted something of my own, and so I said, okay, well, this 401k thing, IRA thing, it's a little bit not tangible enough for me. So let's go find an investment house. And and so that's where I started. 2018, I was in Corpus Christi. I just started driving the streets, looking for something to buy, and that's how it started. When when I remember a couple mornings driving into the refinery where I'm going in, they have these big construction events in oil refining, and you spend long hours, working days, working nights, and I had this moment where I thought to myself, "Oh my gosh, okay, this house, I've been looking at this house and I want to buy it. I think it's a good investment." I'm like freaked out, right? Because on that first one, you just have these nerves. And I had this just voice inside of me say, there's more, and you have to do it. And if you don't do it now, by golly, you have to do it now. You only get one chance at life. And so that was kind of this quiet moment, a turning point where I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And this house was a whopping $25,000 falling off the foundation. And I bought it, and we put a bunch of money into it, and I still own it. Been a wonderful investment. So I could tell you all about that and more. But that's when it started, 2018. So
Amazing. Oh my goodness. Now, that right there, I know most people would probably not go, house falling off of its foundation and, jumping into a different industry, right? You're going from engineering into real estate, and it just seems like you've got a really adventurous tolerance, maybe. High
yeah.
tolerance for fear. And a lot of people aren't comfortable with that. How come you are?
Well, my wife's credit, she would have never thought of this.
Mm,
And I think it's been a wonderful journey for us. But I think this is definitely something that I just learned to be okay with doing something where we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but I'm going to control the outcome as much as possible.
right.
And so part of my growing up years and part of my early adult years was playing the sport of baseball. And
Mm,
I I did college athletics. I played Division I baseball for a couple of years, and I happened to be one of the late inning pitchers where it's all kind of resting on your shoulders to get the game closed
Mm.
out. And so that's just something where I learned to have a lot of fun under pressure and, you know, of course, trying to win in every situation, and bring my team, to a winning season. And so that's something that just kind of brought me a really high risk tolerance, and only because everything's in your control, when you're on the mound as a pitcher. So that's something that I love, and I think, later in my career as an engineer, you learn to mitigate risk, and
Mhm.
and you learn to think of all the possibilities. You learn to do safety and risk analysis, and
Mhm.
that's something that's benefited me a lot throughout my adult career. And kind of, that's after the baseball days, and and so I think there's a lot of synergy between those two experiences for me that's helped me.
That's pretty cool. That is, I just love it when people talk about their past in athletics. I remember when I was playing volleyball, and my volleyball coach would say, "I'm not teaching you volleyball, I'm teaching you life." Do you think that's true?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, I need to hear more about this because that's so true. I mean, athletics is a wonderful way to prepare for life.
Yeah, no, she was a very, very cool lady that was just no nonsense. No one crossed her. And certainly my sister and I both played for her in high school. And she just said, this is how we're going to do things. Your grades come first, volleyball comes second. And if your grades aren't good enough, I don't care if you're the star player, you're not playing. Your grades come first. And she just taught us to be really good humans and just, this is how we're going to do things. And we knew exactly what our boundaries were, right? We knew exactly what to expect. We knew what happened if we showed up late or we forgot our shoes or, we just knew what to expect, which I think is part of it. And even going into business now, setting up these systems and going, you know what? I know what happens if my tenant pays rent late. I know what happens because I have a system, right? And I don't lose sleep at night knowing that I have a system. It's okay. So,
Yeah, and there's this concept, you probably remember, gosh, volleyball is such a fast sport.
yeah,
Boom, boom, back and forth. You only get what, two or three touches until it has to be on the other side.
yeah.
And you can't do that well you can't do any sport well without practice.
Oh,
But
yeah.
there's certain skills that require repetition over and over and over. And in doing this landlord thing, it's the same way. Um,
Yeah.
you have the same conversations over and over, and you get to practice them over and over and over, and over time, you get really, really good at how to manage and influence the outcomes of your business. I mean, that's what real estate is, a business. So
Well, there's only so many questions that a tenant can ask a landlord. That's how I look at it. And I'm on all the landlording forums as well, on Facebook and LinkedIn and other places. And when people jump on, typically on Facebook, they jump on and it's the same 10 problems, right? And it typically starts of I've got this person in, how do I get them out? Now that they're out, how do I get my money? It's like the same 10 things. And I've done all kinds of episodes on this stuff, but at the end of the day, it's one human being a good human to someone else. And how do you structure that? What are the words that you say? What are the systems that you use? What's the philosophy that you use within your company with your employees? Now, I say that knowing that you have, geez, close to 100 employees. Is that right?
yeah, I guess we're getting close to it. I get reminded of the new number about every few months, and I think we're just shy of 100. We lead, I like to say, about 3,000 households in our
Mm.
in our assets, and we in the multifamily, at least in the kind of the 50 units and above space. We have a certain vernacular that we use, and we try to avoid the word tenant,
Mm.
because a lot of our folks and families who live at our communities are there for a long time. And so we've
Yeah.
kind of shifted that. Okay, these are our residents. This is not not an apartment complex. This is a community. And so if we can shift the language a little bit, we get to do leadership in a little bit different way. And we can build it on relationships. And so that's something that's been a lot of fun. And I had no idea about any of that until, you know, having a business partner, having mentors, and there's a lot of people that have been able to help impact me to think about how we lead our communities differently. But that's been one of the transformations. You mentioned questions that residents have or in situations that come up. And so in order to grow a portfolio, I've realized over time that you have to have a philosophy behind some of those questions and situations. Otherwise, you're kind of just pushed to and fro
Right.
by the situation at hand. So figuring out what your philosophy is something that has helped us manage our property a lot more effectively.
Cool. Well, it's really interesting because having that philosophy is, I agree, it's a backbone, right? And we name our companies after, being good humans and, doing things unto others and all of that. And creating community and then living in those communities is something that Mike and I like to do both in Canada and the US. But
Yeah.
I know there's one property that you bought that really didn't have a whole lot of residents in it at the time. And so, how do you approach creating a community when there's hardly anybody there? Do you just start at ground zero and then just sort of, shake everybody's hand and say, hey, this is what we're doing and invite your friends? Like, how do you even start that?
Yeah. Well, when you take over a distressed location, it it's something where you have to produce something that people want to start with.
Yeah.
You have to learn, when you buy an asset, so every asset that we purchase, before we begin ownership of it, really even before we make an offer on it, we establish a vision for what is the next 10 years owning this asset look like as a leader of that community. And it could be empty. Um, so what we establish is essentially who is going to live here, and we try and figure out what the area is like. We do all the underwriting things where you understand your demographics, you understand the age of people that live there. And so the asset that I'm thinking of and that we should talk about is it's in San Marcos, Texas, and it was 25% occupied when we purchased it, and it's in the same town, San Marcos. There's Texas State University,
Mm,
and we came to that deal and ultimately had a business plan built around taking what was a distressed student property and taking it into a long-term rental property. So
mm,
student properties you rent by the bedroom, long-term or conventional you rent it by the apartment unit. And so we got out of the bedroom rental game and immediately came in and began fixing units, turning the vacant apartments. We did an entire exterior remodel within.
mm.
It took us probably 4 months, and we did a complete facelift on the outside. And from the outset, we were really clear on who's going to live here. So we have a mixture of students, a very particular type of student. And then we have a mixture of families who are mostly young families. There's a lot of young families that live in college towns, and so we had to know exactly who we were going to lease to. And at this point, I think we're about 7 months later. We're projected well beyond 50% occupancy, and that's dozens and dozens and dozens of families who have moved in. But it takes a lot of work. That's a
Yeah.
250 plus unit asset, and so you're doing dozens and dozens and dozens of individual apartments, and so there's a whole coordination effort behind that. And so I think for us, what makes those types of investments really good is when we're really clear on our plan. The plan adjusts along the way, but you have to be clear from the outset. And otherwise, you're not really adjusting from anything. So,
Very cool. Very cool. Now, I I am always amazed when I meet other real estate investors who they've just created additional companies instead of hiring additional companies. They've just created it, and that's what you guys have done too in the form of property management. Tell us what made that decision the best choice. Like, why didn't you just hire someone?
yeah. Well, I can step back for a second and let me kind of give you a high level picture of our portfolio.
Sure.
So my business partner started in about 2013, and I didn't get into real estate, like I said earlier, till about 2018. And we had both begun the real estate journey in our own individual ways, and we met in 2019 after I had tried that first rental house, and I had begun to syndicate a couple of apartments, and he had recently syndicated and purchased with his family several assets, and so by about 2020 we came together and we were investing in properties together, and we brought each of our portfolios along the way. And so combined at the time, I think it was maybe maybe 8 or 9 assets around 2020, and then by 2022 we were into the low teens.
Mhm.
And today we just broken beyond the 20 asset mark. So that's about 2,700 doors and change today, and I think it looks like we'll punch through the 3,000 doors mark middle of this year. And so for us, the reason that we love the property management business so much is because it allows us to perform our investments at a higher level than somebody else who manages it. And so we're what you call a fully integrated portfolio. A lot of us who have bought a few rentals, like a single family residence or a duplex or a fourplex, and have several of those across town or maybe throughout the country. Many of them are self-managed, that people will go and manage your own investment property. Um,
Mhm.
and then many will third party out management to a third party management company. And there's also a lot of larger asset operators in kind of the 50 doors plus space, where you just hand, your fifty uh, apartment community to a third party management company. And there's plenty of big management companies. And what we find is that the third party management space, they're not incentivized to to watch your budget. You give them a
Mhm.
budget, and that's the last thing they think about, really, because what most third-party managers are paid on is the income. So they'll maximize income, and the budget is a little bit secondary. So it creates not such it's not focused on cash flow. And most of us, what we care about is cash flow. I'm a cash flow investor. And so what we've said is that if we can manage well, we're going to maximize cash flow. And therefore, when my cash flow is healthy, um, we have lower risk. And
Mhm.
so it's really about control. Um, and that's what property management has allowed us to do. So we're fully integrated. We have a property management business, and then we have an investment management business, and they're very much integrated together in a way where you can't quite tell the two apart. And I think that's by design because you want information to flow freely between those two activities, property management and asset management. And
Mhm.
that gets to maybe the second major problem with, in my view, the third party management space is communication doesn't flow freely between
Mhm.
the investment manager and the property manager if they are not in the same organization and if they don't have the same
Mhm.
goals. And
Right.
so That's something that I think has been the key to our success is having a fully integrated portfolio where we manage, I know the family, the spouses' names of most, if not all of my team members. And this is something where we've created a really good team of people who love to work together and trust each other. And, sometimes we disagree, but we built a culture on relationships. And so that's something that we love.
That's very cool. Well, Derek, taking that into the next deal, whatever the next deal is for you, knowing that one of your philosophies is that you don't ever want to sell something, how do you go into a deal knowing that that's sort of your end game? Do you underwrite for a whole time off the hop, or do you deliberately do multiple iterations? Like, walk us through how you actually get there, because there's a lot of us that do that. Mike and I are the
Yeah.
same way.
Yeah. So I think from an underwriting standpoint, you want to plan your activities around your cash resources. And this is something I actually learned in the refining industry. In manufacturing, in general, the manufacturing process creates cash flow. And then you have times when you need to take part of the process offline and spend some of that cash flow to revitalize your manufacturing process, whatever your equipment is. Apartment buildings are the same way, and real estate in general is the same way. So what we do when we underwrite is we underwrite over 5 year to maybe sometimes up to 7 year time horizons. And so what you see a lot in the syndication space that I'm in is you'll have an investment life of say 5 or 7 or maybe as long as 10 years.
Hmm.
And that's because most debt products are on 5, 7, and 10 year life cycles or a term. And that's in the commercial lending world. Now, in some of the smaller or residential, 1 to 4 unit lending options, you can have a 30-year loan, and that's great. And you might need to plan differently if you're underwriting over that type of time frame. But
Hmm.
for us, we plan in 5 year stints. And so what I'll do is I'll literally look at our due diligence process, and we have a 400 point checklist that we hit in our due diligence process. And probably 20 of those points have to do with contractors we talk to.
Hmm.
Um, and each of those could be broken into another dozen or two points for each line. And we just go literally brick by brick, and we look at everything that we're satisfied with and then everything we're dissatisfied with. And when we get to that list of things we're dissatisfied with that we find during our due diligence process, we'll take that and say, okay, how much of this needs to happen within the next 5 years? And then literally what we do is we take money and say, okay, it's going to cost us so many dollars per door to take care of these items we're dissatisfied with, and we're going to address these right away. And then what we do is we have another list of things, oh, we can probably wait for 5 years. And that list will put money in reserve. And then when our next loan comes due, we'll either make a decision when we refinance, maybe we need to take some equity and put it back into those items, or if that list is small enough, the reserve is going to be able to cover it. But we always come up front with the cash to get us through the 5 to 7 year time frame. And so
Okay.
that's a philosophy that you have to just learn to plan ahead and get into the details of your inspections.
Hmm. Yeah, the devil's in the details, as one engineer to another. I know you appreciate that.
That's right.
Well, and
Um,
speaking of the details, there's a lot of commercial folks in multifamily in particular that are getting into trouble right now, and they've, been too aggressive in their underwriting. They've made assumptions they probably shouldn't have made, and they're handing properties back to lenders. And you and I talked about this whole heavy on debt, equity, ignoring the yield in the middle. How do you manage that balance when you're operating this, knowing that you're underwriting in the 5 to 7 year game plan, like you said? How do you make sure that you've left enough yield to be comfortable?
Yeah. Yeah. So there are a couple philosophies and it can be kind of a technical conversation, but um, essentially what's happened since 2022
Mm,
is where commercial real estate values were really high in 2021, 2022, and they were on the rise ever since maybe say 2018 when I really started paying attention to this space. And with the peak in values in 2022, a lot of people transacted at that time, and when you can't read the future, sometimes you make short-sighted decisions. And so
mm,
a lot of investors in the marketplace are right now, 4 years later, with property in their portfolios where they purchased at a pretty high price and they have a lot of debt. And there's there's a reckoning that takes place. And so what we're seeing right now is because of interest rates in 2022 going up, that there's been a shift in values down.
mhm,
And so there's a lot of opportunity to go purchase property at a much lower value than they were at that time. We tend to look at our portfolio from a leverage standpoint where we say, okay, here's today's value. How much debt do we have? And then how much equity is left after accounting for your debt? And so there's really two buckets. If you think of your portfolio as, a bucket and it's half filled with debt and the rest of that bucket is air, you can say that you're roughly 50% leveraged. And when you overfill a bucket with too much debt or you've over leveraged your portfolio, your options go away and you're going to be, really putting a lot of pressure on your cash flow. So the way we tend to look at our portfolio is how productive is the portfolio relative to our equity? Or in other words, um, how much does our existing equity make as a percentage of its yearly cash flow? And so that's
mhm,
something we call return on equity. Um, and what we like to do is we like to compare our going in yield when we purchase an investment with the yield, say 5 years later, compared with that
mm,
purchase price. And so when we look at our going in yield, if we can usually take a yield of say 7% going in, maybe 6.5% going in Texas, that's where we're at, and turn it into a 9% yield within say 3 to 4 years, uh, in a conservative underwriting situation, that's when some of our investments start to make sense and we'll actually pursue them. And so really what we're looking at is kind of the change in yield over time through our business plan. And then after 5 years, when we're going into that first term of the investment, we'll say, okay, we're at a 9% yield and we bought it at say a 6.5, and maybe we're higher. Many of our deals have done much better than our original projection. Um, but you get to that 5 year mark, you need to reset your thinking about how productive today's equity is now 5 years later. And so that's where that return on equity thought process begins to take shape. So if I bought a property for $10 million and after 5 years, um, and I have, so let's just say I started with $7 million of debt.
Hmm.
And after 5 years, the property is now worth $15 million.
Hmm.
And I have that $7 million of debt coming due where I have to refinance it. And I'm at the 5 year mark. I'm going to look at, well, can I refinance it and get more debt out? Because now I have $8 million of equity with the $7
Right.
million of debt on a $15 million property now. So that $8 million of equity is something that I need to see, I need to watch and see how productive is that $8 million now? Is it cash flowing at 2%, where it used to be, maybe it started at 7 or 8.
Right.
Is it now at 2 because I've jumped how much equity is in the property? And so the way that we'll typically try and make the portfolio the most productive is we'll size our debt based on how productive today's equity is. And so we like to see return on equity of at least 6% on existing properties. And so we'll refi up until we get to about that number.
Hmm.
And what we find is that it doesn't over leverage you if you're looking at your equity based on how productive it is. And so what we find is that lands us somewhere right around maybe the 60% leverage, 65% leverage mark. And so that's something I didn't really think about until later on when we developed this process. I'm like, oh, wow, it all works out. I like this return on equity thing.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Well, I know just a couple weeks ago, you guys went on a trip. And I know that's part of being an entrepreneur is that you get to work wherever you want. I do the same thing. And
Yeah.
you chose Peru. Why Peru?
Yeah. Well, we went to Peru with a humanitarian group. They do
Mm,
surgeries in third world countries,
wow.
and they do the eye surgeries with local doctors, which is cool. Um,
Really? That's very
yeah,
cool.
yeah. So what you see a lot in a lot of like medically based humanitarian organizations is they'll like ship doctors across the world to go do a specialized treatment of some sort, right? And if you can't get the doctor from the United States across the world to this other place, then it's kind of, you're kind of limiting what you can accomplish. But we really had a great time with them. And there's some family connections, and a
Okay.
lot of our investor network is really well acquainted with this group. So we went to Peru and we got to go see a bunch of fun culture, and we got to see the antiquities of everybody's heard of Machu Picchu, and some of the really fun ancient sites. And so that was an extraordinary experience, and really wouldn't have got that opportunity without the relationships that have been built through real estate. So
Of
that
course.
was a wonderful experience.
Very, that's amazing. That's amazing. And you and I talked about the difference of happiness of people in more modern civilization versus people like in Peru who are,
Yeah.
have dirt floors and very simple lives, and they're very happy. They're
Yeah.
very happy. No, that's good.
Yeah,
Well,
well, I'll tell you one experience from there. So we were in the Andes Mountains, and we went and visited the millionth patient of this organization. And uh, she she every few years there, we get to go kind of check out how her life is going, and she invites people up, and they literally lived on the top of this mountain, probably way over 10,000 feet in altitude. And
wow.
and they just got to show us their way of life, and we learned about what they do. There's an annual harvest. There's a cycle and a season to everything that's happening, and they've just learned to become reliant on the earth and on their local community, and completely self-sustaining up in the mountains. It's just amazing. And I think one of them pulled out a phone. And I was like, "Whoa, what's that doing here?" And but it's just extraordinary that we come from this ultra connected, maybe overstimulated culture, with the internet and advertising and social media kind of blasting from all directions. And it was a great reset for me to just remember ultimately what this comes down to is relationships. And that's something that for me as I've stepped into the entrepreneurial space has become the core value is what's the quality of my relationships, and that's going to be what dictates my future satisfaction and happiness, of me and my family. And so it's those moments that kind of give you the reset.
That's very cool. That's very cool. Well, what's one of the things that if you knew then that you know now, maybe you do something different? Because I got a lot of young landlord listeners, maybe not biologically young, but young landlord listeners who are thinking, well, I wonder what he would have done different if. What's one thing you might would have done different when you bought that house in Corpus Christi? It was falling off its foundation.
Oh, well, yeah, and I should have told you more about that story, I think. But the thing that I learned from that project, and I've learned this lesson over and over and over again, there is a value to the time it takes for you to complete something.
Mm,
Now we represent dozens of investors in a single asset who invest alongside us. We bring the equity with us. We invest our own capital, and we bring, either a couple people to maybe a couple dozen people into a deal. And as an engineer, you're constantly making, for me, and it's not just an engineering thing, this is an everybody thing, but sometimes it's easy to be fixated on this cost of doing a project. And what you don't always see is that sometimes you might want to pay a little more and get it done really quickly.
hmm
And that original house in Corpus Christi that I purchased for 25 grand falling off the foundation, that house took me a year to fix. And
Oh my.
I ended up lifting the house like a foot off the foundation and repouring all the concrete piers and redoing the beams, and I enlisted half the neighborhood to help me, and all this craziness, and it took me twice as long as it should have. And so I think there's this concept that you have to get 90% of the answer in 10% of the time.
Mm,
And as a new investor, you don't always see the value of the time, because in real estate, one of the beautiful things is the cash flow will make up for for small mistakes.
yeah.
Not big mistakes. Big mistakes really hurt. You can't make
hmm
big mistakes. But the small mistakes, the cash flow can make up. And the small differences in cost on a project can be made up if you get to cash flow sooner.
hmm
And you know what else goes down, when you get to cash flow sooner is your stress level.
Yes.
My stress level goes down if I get to cash flow sooner. So that's something that took me a couple of years to figure out. And now I think we see that really clearly. Um, we don't go with the cheapest contractor.
Mm,
We go with the one that we know will hit the timeline and do it efficiently. Um, so so that's a technical learning, I think, and it takes a little bit of trial and error. And I would have told myself that in 2018.
yeah. Not always about the money. It's the grief to dollars ratio. That's how I always say it. The grief to
Yeah.
dollars ratio has to work. And if your goal is time, then make the time work. The grief to dollars ratio work in favor of the time, which is cool. Yeah. Derek, it's so great having you on the show. I'm so happy to have a chat with you. Any parting thoughts?
Um, I love the real estate business, and there's so many ways to do it. You can you can, go be hands-on and go build a portfolio of 20, 30, 10 single family residences. You can do short-term rentals, and you can do commercial, you can do syndications, you can
Mhm.
do RV parks. And really, my parting thought is get clear on the impact that you want to have in your community, in the people that you serve through your assets.
Mhm.
And the asset class will then clarify for you. Because what you ultimately are as a real estate investor is you're providing something for people. Uh, I have a mentor, and he always says real estate is about people, and I love that concept. And that doesn't come from me, but it's something that I fully believe. And so figure out what your underlying philosophy is, and then your asset class, how active you want to be versus being hands-on, self-managing,
Mhm.
or being passive and investing alongside others who want to be hands-on for you. You want to figure out what your philosophy is and what your goal is with that investment. Am I buying time for myself? Well, then I need to think about how to be passive. Um, then everything becomes clear as far as asset class, who to work with, and all those questions that happen early in the real estate journey. So that's my parting thought.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, have a good one.